The rain had been falling since noon, and by the time the light began to fail it had turned from a soft gray drizzle into something with weight behind it. Something that drummed against rooftops and turned the lanes of Marlow Hollow into rivers of brown mud. Inside the small shop at the end of Weaver's Row, a single candle burned on the counter, and the smell of wet wool and beeswax and hot tallow filled the narrow room. Eleanor Hartley sat at her work table with a needle between her fingers, mending the hem of a farmer's wife's petticoat by candlelight, when she heard the bell above the door give a thin, uncertain ring. She looked up. A man stood in the doorway, soaked through, his dark coat torn clean across one shoulder, water running from his hair down the line of his jaw. "Forgive me," he said. His voice was low, and there was something careful in it, something that did not quite match the mud on his boots. "I saw the candle. I did not mean to startle you." "You didn't," Eleanor said, though her heart was beating a little too fast. She set down the petticoat and rose. "Come in out of it, at least. You'll catch your death standing there." He stepped inside, and the door swung shut behind him, cutting off the roar of the rain to a steady murmur against the shutters. Up close she could see he was younger than she had first thought, and taller, with the kind of straight-backed bearing that farmers and tradesmen did not usually have, though his clothes said otherwise. His boots were good leather, but scuffed as if he had walked farther than he was used to walking. His coat, dark green wool, was well cut, but the seam at the shoulder had torn wide open, as though he had caught it on a branch or a fence rail and pulled hard to free himself. "You've torn your coat," she said, because it seemed a safer thing to say than any of the questions crowding behind her teeth. "Who are you? Why are you walking the road from Ashcombe in a storm with no horse and no servant? Why do your hands, when I glance at them, look as though they have never split a log or turned a plow, and yet you carry yourself like a man who has walked a very long way on his own 2 feet without complaint?" "I caught it on a gate," he said. "There was a ewe stuck in the wire on the Ashcombe road. I could not leave her there in this weather." Eleanor looked at him a moment longer. "You stopped to free a sheep that was not yours, in a storm, and tore your coat doing it. It seemed the only decent thing to do." She found that she believed him, though she could not have said why. There was mud on his sleeves in a pattern that matched pulling at wire, and a thin scratch along the back of one hand that had not yet stopped bleeding. She reached for a cloth without thinking and pressed it into his palm. "Sit," she said, nodding at the stool by the fire. "I'll look at the coat. It's a poor night to be walking anywhere in a torn coat, whoever you are." "Julian," he said after the smallest pause, as though the name were a coat he was trying on for size. "Julian Wren." "Eleanor Hartley." She took the coat from his shoulders as he shrugged out of it, and the weight of the wet wool surprised her. It was heavier than the coats she was used to mending, finer somehow beneath the mud, though she told herself that was only her imagination working too hard on a stranger's account. "Sit by the fire, Mr. Wren. I'll have this stitched before the rain lets up, if it ever means to let up tonight." He sat. She worked. The fire popped and settled, and the candle guttered once in a draught from the door before steadying again, and for a long while neither of them spoke, and the only sounds in the little shop were the rain against the shutters and the small, steady whisper of her needle through the torn wool. He was, in fact, no clerk and no traveler of humble means at all. He was Julian Ashworth Vane, Duke of Ravensmere, and 3 days earlier he had ridden out from his own estate with nothing but a plain coat, a purse of common coin, and a name borrowed from the hedge wren that had startled his horse on the drive, because he had grown so tired of being courted for his title that he could no longer tell whether any woman who smiled at him was smiling at the man or at the deed to his lands. He had been 23 when his father died and left him the dukedom, and in the 6 years since, he had watched a procession of carefully arranged young ladies pass through his drawing rooms, each one lovelier than the last, each one educated in exactly the accomplishments a duchess was meant to have, and each one, without fail, looking past his shoulder at the portraits of his ancestors on the wall behind him rather than at his face. He had begun, somewhere in the last 2 years, to believe that there was no woman left in England who could look at him and see anything but Ravensmere. So when his aunt had written to say that a Miss Hartley of Marlow Hollow, a seamstress of good reputation and no fortune at all, had once turned away a marquis's younger son because she found him dull, Julian had laughed aloud at his desk, and then, 3 days later, had found himself riding south with no name and no title and a coat he did not mind ruining, because a woman who would refuse a title for dullness was a woman he wished very much to meet honestly. He had not planned the storm. He had not planned the sheep either, though he did not regret it. And he had certainly not planned to be sitting in a candlelit shop with his coat across a stranger's knees, watching her mend it with small, sure stitches, feeling something in his chest loosen that had been drawn tight for longer than he could remember. "You're not from Ashcombe," Eleanor said, without looking up from her work. "Your boots are too fine for a farmhand, and your hands are too soft for a groom, and you speak like a man who has read more books than most gentlemen I've met, and yet you tell me you were walking the road alone with no coat for the weather and no plan for where you'd sleep tonight. I don't think you're a liar, Mr. Wren. I only think you're not telling me everything." He looked at her for a long moment. The firelight moved across her face, catching the loose strands of hair that had come free of its pins, and he found himself thinking that she had a very direct way of looking at a person, as though she were already deciding what to make of him and did not much care whether he liked her conclusions. "I am a man between situations," he said carefully. "I had a position that no longer suited me, and I am walking until I find one that does. That is truer than it sounds evasive, I promise you." "That's a fine answer for a man who doesn't want to answer," she said, but there was no anger in it, only a small, dry amusement, and she bit off her thread and held the coat up to the candlelight to check her stitching. "There. It will hold. Not pretty, but it will hold through worse rain than this. It's better than the coat deserves," he said, and meant it more than she could know. "You'll want it to dry before you put it on again, unless you mean to catch a fever on top of everything else." She rose and hung the coat on a peg near the fire, and when she turned back she found him watching her with an expression she could not quite name, something between gratitude and a kind of careful wonder, as if she had done something far larger than mend a seam. "You're staring, Mr. Wren. Forgive me." He looked down at his hands. "It has been a long while since anyone did something for me without wanting something back." Eleanor considered that, and found she believed it too, though it seemed a strange thing for a man of no particular fortune to say. "Well, you needn't worry on my account. I mend coats for a living. It's no great kindness, only my trade." "I don't think that's true," he said quietly. "I think you would have mended it even if it were not your trade." She did not answer that directly, only busied herself putting the kettle over the fire, but the corner of her mouth curved in a way that told him he had guessed correctly, and something in him settled a little further, the way a man settles into a chair he has been standing beside for a very long time. The storm did not let up. By the time the tea was made, the rain had turned to something closer to a flood, water running fast along the gutters outside, and Eleanor, after a moment's consideration that he could see cost her something, told him there was a small room above the shop, once her brother's, empty since he had gone for a soldier 2 years past, and that he was welcome to it for the night if he had nowhere better to go. "I have nowhere at all to go," Julian admitted. "I would be grateful." "Don't be too grateful," she said, climbing the narrow stair ahead of him with the candle. "It's a poor room. There's a soldier's cot and a trunk and a window that lets in more draft than light. My brother never minded. He said a man who has slept in a ditch doesn't complain about a draft. Your brother sounds a sensible man. He is, when he's not doing something foolish, which is often." She set the candle on the trunk and looked around the small room with the particular fondness of someone remembering another person entirely. "He'll be home again by autumn, God willing. Then you'll have to give up the cot to him, but I expect you'll be gone by then anyway." "I expect I will," Julian said, though something in his chest argued otherwise the moment the words left his mouth. She left him there with the candle and a blanket from the trunk, and he lay awake along while listening to the rain ease slowly into a steady patter and then into silence, thinking of her hands moving over the torn wool, of the direct gray eyes that had looked at him and seen a man with a secret rather than a man with a title, and of how strange it was that the first honest evening he had spent in 6 years had come to him in a mended coat and a borrowed name. In the morning the sky had washed itself clean, and the lane outside smelled of wet earth and turned leaves, and Julian came down the narrow stair to find Eleanor already at her work table, a length of blue cloth spread before her, cutting a pattern with quick, certain movements of her shears. "You slept," she said, not looking up. "Better than I have in weeks. That's the country air. London men always say so when they come through." She glanced at him then, a quick, assessing look. "You are a London man, whatever else you are. I'd stake the shop on it." He inclined his head, neither confirming nor denying, and she made a small sound that might have been satisfaction at being right, or might have been simple acknowledgement that he did not mean to tell her more than he already had. "Your coat is dry," she said, nodding to where it hung by the cold hearth. "You could be on your way within the hour if you've somewhere to be." He looked at the coat, and then at her, and found that he did not want to put it on and walk out into the lane and never see this small shop or this direct, unimpressed woman again. "I find I am in no particular hurry," he said. "Is there work to be had in Marlow Hollow, for a man willing to turn his hand to most things?" Eleanor set down her shears and studied him properly for the first time that morning, taking in the line of his shoulders and the careful, watchful way he held himself, as though he were still deciding how much of himself to show her. "There's always work in a village, if a man's not afraid of it. Old Tom Fenner needs help with his hay before the next rain spoils it. The smith's boy is laid up with a fever, and there's shoes to be set. And I'll admit," she added, with the faintest trace of dry humor, "my own shop could use a man who doesn't mind hauling bolts of cloth from the cart without complaining of his back." "I don't complain of my back," Julian said. "I have never had the opportunity to discover whether I would." She laughed at that, a short, surprised sound, as though it had escaped her before she meant to let it, and Julian thought that he would have walked twice as far through twice as bad a storm to hear it again. He stayed. He told himself it would be a week, no more, long enough to see whether the woman who had mended his coat by candlelight was the same woman by daylight, whether her kindness to a stranger was a passing thing or the true shape of her, and long enough, too, if he was honest with himself in the small hours when honesty came easiest, to see whether what had loosened in his chest that first night would tighten again once the novelty wore off, the way it always had before. It did not tighten. If anything, it loosened further. He hauled bolts of cloth from Tom Fenner's cart and did not complain of his back, though it ached fiercely by the second day. He helped stack the hay before the next rain came, working alongside men who called him Wren and clapped him on the shoulder and asked no questions beyond whether he could be trusted with a pitchfork, which turned out to be a lower bar than any drawing room in London had ever set for him. He learned that Eleanor rose before dawn to cut patterns while the light was clean and the shop was quiet, that she hummed under her breath when a seam pleased her and fell entirely silent when one did not, that she gave credit to families who could not pay and never spoke of it to anyone, that she had raised herself and, for 2 years since her mother's death, had very nearly raised the whole of Weaver's Row as well, mending torn coats and worse torn fortunes with the same quiet, unfussy competence. He learned, too, that she was watched. There was a man named Josiah Blunt, a merchant with a warehouse in the next town and a way of leaning in doorways as though he owned them, who came through Marlow Hollow twice in Julian's first week there, each time finding some reason to stop at the shop, each time looking at Eleanor with an expression Julian did not care for at all, proprietary and patient, the look of a man counting down days he believed were owed to him. "He wants the shop," Eleanor said flatly, the second time Blunt had gone, when Julian asked, as carefully as he could, who the man was and why his jaw had tightened watching him leave. "My father borrowed against it before he died. More than I knew until the debt came due. Blunt holds the note now. He says he'll forgive it entirely, if I'll marry him. And if you won't, then I owe him £40 by Michaelmas, which I do not have, and he takes the shop instead." She said it the way she said most difficult things, plainly, without asking for pity, bent over her work table as if the matter were no more troubling than a stubborn seam. "I have 3 months to find £40 or a husband I can bear, and I find I would rather lose the shop than take the second option, whatever that says about my good sense." Julian said nothing to that, not then, though something hard and quiet had settled behind his ribs, a feeling he recognized after a moment as anger, clean and focused, the first true anger he had felt in longer than he could remember, because the thought of Josiah Blunt leaning in a doorway counting down the days until Eleanor Hartley had no choice but to marry him made Julian want to put his fist through something. He was, after all, a duke with £40 to spare 100 times over, sitting in her shop under a false name, saying nothing, and the shame of that silence sat in him like a stone for the rest of the week, because he knew precisely how easily he could end Blunt's game, and he knew, too, that if he did it as Julian Wren, penniless traveler, the money would come from nowhere anyone could explain, and if he did it as the Duke of Ravensmere, he would have to tell her everything, and he was not yet ready to lose the version of himself she had come to know, the one who hauled cloth without complaint and mended fences and slept easily under a soldier's blanket, the one she looked at, when she looked at him at all, without any calculation in her eyes. He told himself he had time. He told himself Michaelmas was 3 months off. He told himself a great many things, in the weeks that followed, to avoid the plain fact sitting at the center of all of them, which was that he had come to Marlow Hollow to find out whether a woman could love him without knowing what he was, and that the longer he stayed silent, the crueler the answer would be when at last she learned the truth. By the end of the second week, he no longer thought of leaving at all. He thought, instead, of the way Eleanor's hands moved when she measured cloth against a customer's shoulder, quick and sure and gentle all at once. He thought of the evening she had shown him how to set a proper hem and laughed at his clumsy first attempt, not unkindly, and taken his hand to guide the needle herself, her fingers rough at the tips in a way no lady's hands in London had ever been, and warm and steady. He thought of the morning she had caught him staring at her across the work table and had not looked away, only raised an eyebrow and asked, quite calmly, what he found so interesting, and he had not had an honest answer that did not risk everything, so he had said only, "The light suits this room in the morning," which was true, and also entirely beside the point, and she had known it and let it go anyway. The way she seemed to let a great many things go with him that she would not have let go with anyone else. He was falling in love with her, slowly and completely, in a mended coat and a borrowed name, and he had no earthly idea how he was going to tell her the truth without losing the one thing in 6 years that had ever felt entirely his own. The third week brought an early frost, and with it, a letter that found Julian even in Marlow Hollow, carried by a rider his steward had sent out searching in ever-widening circles once too much time had passed without word. The rider found him at dusk, coming up from Tom Fenner's field with hay dust still on his sleeves, and the man's face, when he recognized the Duke of Ravensmere standing in a laborer's coat in a country lane, went through such a rapid succession of confusion and alarm that Julian nearly laughed, despite everything. He read the letter by the last of the daylight. His aunt was unwell, not gravely, but enough that his presence was wanted, and there were papers from the estate that required his signature within the fortnight, matters that could not wait on a duke's holiday from himself. He stood a long while in the lane with the letter in his hand, watching the smoke rise from the shop's chimney at the far end of Weaver's Row, and understood that the choice he had been avoiding for 3 weeks had just been made for him, whether he liked it or not. He told her that night. He had meant to tell her gently, in his own time, in a manner of his own choosing, but the letter had stolen that choice from him, and so he told her plainly, sitting across the work table from her in the candlelight, in almost the same place he had sat that first stormy evening while she mended his coat. "My name is not Wren," he said. "It is Julian Ashworth Vane. I am the Duke of Ravensmere." The shears stopped moving in her hands. She did not look up at once, and when she did, her face had gone very still, the particular stillness he had learned, in 3 weeks of watching her, meant she was holding something back with great effort. "A duke," she said slowly. "Yes. Walking the Ashcombe Road alone, in a storm, with no coat fit for the weather, freeing sheep from wire fences. Yes. And you let me believe, for 3 weeks, that you were a man with nowhere to go and nothing to your name. I let you believe it because I wanted, for once in my life, to be looked at as a man and not as a title," he said. "I have spent 6 years watching women smile at Ravensmere and never once at me. I did not know, when I came here, whether there was a difference, or whether I was only telling myself a comforting story. I know now. There is a difference. You are the difference." Eleanor set down her shears very carefully, as though she did not trust her hands to hold them steady otherwise, and rose from the table and walked to the window, and stood there with her back to him for a long moment, looking out at the dark lane. "You let me talk to you about Blunt," she said at last, her voice low and even in a way that told him she was working very hard to keep it that way. "You let me tell you I would rather lose my shop than marry a man who wanted it more than he wanted me. You sat there and said nothing, when you could have ended it with a signature and never felt the loss of it at all. I know. Why didn't you? Because the moment I told you the truth, I would stop being Wren, who hauled your cloth and mended fences and slept in your brother's cot, and I would become a duke offering charity to a seamstress, and I did not know how to bear that, not yet, not before I understood whether you could ever look at Ravensmere the way you looked at Wren." He rose too, though he did not cross the room to her, understanding, in the way he had learned to understand a great many things in 3 weeks of watching her closely, that she needed the space between them just then more than she needed him closer. I should have told you sooner. I know that. I let my own fear cost you weeks you might have spent with a plan of your own, and I am sorrier for that than for anything I have done in a very long while. She was quiet for a long time. The fire settled and popped behind them. When she finally turned to face him, her eyes were bright but her voice, when it came, was steady. I don't know what to do with a duke, she said. I know what to do with Ren. Ren hauls cloth and doesn't complain of his back and laughed at himself when I taught him to set a hem badly the first time. I don't know the man who owns half the county and could have ended Blunt's threat with a word and chose, instead, to let me carry it alone for 3 weeks. He is the same man, Julian said quietly. I promise you that. The coat is different. The man beneath it has not changed at all. That is very easy to say. It is. I know it is. I would not blame you for not believing it yet. He drew a slow breath. I have papers waiting for me at Ravensmere that cannot wait longer than a fortnight. I must go. I will not ask you to decide anything before I do. But I will tell you this so that you know it plainly and cannot mistake it for flattery. Blunt's note on this shop will be paid before I leave this village, in full, with no condition attached to it, and no expectation that it buys me anything from you at all. You will owe him nothing, and you will owe me nothing either. Whatever comes after that is entirely yours to decide, in your own time, free of any debt to any man. You would do that even if I never spoke to you again. I would do it especially if you never spoke to me again, he said. I did not come to Marlow Hollow to purchase anything, Eleanor. Least of all you. She did not answer that. She only looked at him for a long moment, her arms folded, her face unreadable in the candlelight, and then she said very quietly that she thought he had better go up to bed, and that she needed time to think, and he did not press her further, because he understood, better than most men might have, exactly how much he had asked her to absorb in the space of one evening. He left Marlow Hollow 3 days later, before dawn, so as not to make a spectacle of a duke's departure in a village that had known him only as a laborer named Ren. He did not see Eleanor before he left. She had kept to the shop the last 2 days, polite but distant, and he had let her have that distance, telling himself it was hers to claim as long as she needed it. He rode north with his own name restored to him and his own coat, the dark blue one with proper buttons, waiting for him at the posting inn where his steward had left it, and he found, putting it on again, that it fit him exactly as it always had, and yet felt strange on his shoulders in a way it never had before, too fine, too far from the wool she had mended by candlelight. The note on the shop was paid before he left, exactly as he had promised, delivered by his solicitor under a name that meant nothing to Blunt and everything to no one but Julian himself, with a clause that forgave the debt outright and required nothing whatsoever in return. Blunt, it was reported to Julian some weeks later, left the district entirely, his leverage gone and his patience with a village that no longer feared him exhausted along with it. Julian did not write to her. He told himself this was a kind of respect, giving her the room she had asked for, but in his more honest hours, lying awake in his own vast bed at Ravensmere beneath a ceiling painted with cherubs he had never once found comforting. He suspected it was also fear, plain and unglamorous, the fear that a letter from a duke would only remind her of exactly the distance she had named that last night, and that anything he might write would sound like Ravensmere pleading rather than Ren asking, honestly, for a second chance. Autumn deepened into a hard, bright cold. His aunt recovered. The papers were signed. The business of the dukedom went on around him, dinners and correspondence and the slow grinding machinery of an estate that did not pause for a man's private unhappiness, and Julian moved through all of it with the particular, contained steadiness of a man who has learned to carry a weight without letting anyone see him carrying it, and thought, more often than he would have admitted to a single living soul, of a small shop at the end of Weaver's Row, and of gray eyes that had looked at him, and seen a man rather than a title right up until the moment they had seen the title too, and gone carefully, deliberately still. He did not go back for 6 weeks. He told himself he was giving her time. He suspected, when he was honest with himself, that he was also giving himself time, gathering the courage to face whatever answer waited for him at the end of that lane, because a man who has been refused by every woman who ever truly knew what he was offering learns to fear the asking more than the answer. It was Eleanor's brother, in the end, who forced the matter. He had come home on leave in early winter, tall and sun-browned and full of a soldier's blunt good humor, and had heard the whole story from the village within a day of his arrival, and had ridden, without asking his sister's permission, the 2 days north to Ravensmere itself, where he presented himself at the great door in his uniform and asked, with the particular fearlessness of a man who has faced worse than a duke's butler, to speak with the Duke of Ravensmere on a matter of some urgency. Julian received him in the small study rather than the formal one, and listened, and felt something in his chest that had been clenched for 6 weeks begin very slowly to loosen. She won't say so, Tom Hartley told him, sitting stiffly in a chair too fine for his uniform, turning his hat over in his hands. She's proud, my sister, prouder than sense allows sometimes. But she's mended every coat in Marlow Hollow twice over since you left and hasn't laughed once that I've heard of. Not since I came home, and she keeps a length of green wool in the trunk upstairs that she won't sell and won't explain. And I am not a clever man, your grace, but I know my sister, and I know that is not a woman who has forgotten you. I did not think she wished to see me again. I don't know what she wishes, Tom said honestly. I only know she deserves the chance to say so herself, rather than have you decide it for her from 2 days right away, the same as you decided things for her without asking, if you'll forgive my saying so, when you first came through her door under a false name. It was, Julian thought, exactly the kind of blunt truth he had been missing in 6 years of drawing rooms full of careful flattery, and he found he did not resent it in the least, coming from a soldier in his sister's cause. He thanked Tom Hartley, and gave orders for his best horse to be saddled within the hour, and rode south through the winter cold with something that felt very like hope beating hard and unfamiliar in his chest, all the way to Marlow Hollow. He arrived at dusk, exactly as he had the first time, though this time in his own coat, on his own horse, with his own name ready on his lips. The shop window was lit, the same candle glow spilling into the lane, and through the glass he could see her at the work table, bent over a length of green wool, her needle moving in small, careful stitches, and something in the sight of it, so achingly familiar, nearly undid him before he had even opened the door. The bell rang thin and uncertain above him, exactly as it had that first stormy night, and Eleanor looked up, and for one long moment neither of them moved at all. You came back, she said finally. I should never have stayed away so long, he said. I told myself I was giving you time. I think, in truth, I was giving myself time to work up the courage to be refused properly, which is a coward's excuse, and I am sorry for it. She set down the green wool. He saw now that it was being shaped into something like a coat, cut smaller than a man's, and he did not understand it until she lifted it and held it toward the candlelight, and he saw the careful stitching along one shoulder, mended in advance, as though she had been repairing a tear that had not yet happened. I started this the week after you left, she admitted, and her voice, for the first time since he had known her, was not entirely steady. I told myself it was foolishness. I told myself a duke does not come back to a village shop for a seamstress who sent him off without a proper answer. I mended the shoulder first before I had cut half the rest of it because I could not stop thinking of the first coat, and of how it felt to have you sit there and trust me with it, before either of us knew what the other truly was. Eleanor. He crossed the room to her now, and she let him, did not step back, only watched him come with those direct gray eyes that had never once, in all the weeks he had known her, looked away from anything difficult. I am not asking you to become a duchess. I know that frightens you, and I understand why. I am asking whether Eleanor Hartley could bear to spend her life with Julian Vane, who happens, inconveniently, to also be a duke, and who has never in 6 years wanted anything as plainly and completely as he wants to sit across a work table from you every evening for the rest of his life, in whatever coat you'll have him wear. She was quiet a long moment, searching his face the way she had searched it that very first night, weighing him. He understood now, not as a title or a fortune but simply as a man. The same careful weighing she gave to every seam before she trusted it to hold. I don't know how to be a duchess, she said at last. I don't know how to be anything but a duke, he answered. I have been learning, these last months, that a man can be more than one thing at once. I should like very much to learn the rest of it beside you, if you'll allow it. She looked down at the small green coat in her hands, at the careful mended shoulder, and then up at him, and something in her face broke open at last into the smile he had been waiting 6 weeks to see again, small and slow and entirely her own. You'll have to learn to set a proper hem first, she said. I won't have a duke embarrassing my shop with clumsy stitches. I accept the terms, Julian said, and found, when he reached for her hand, that she did not hesitate at all to give it. They were married in the spring, in the small stone church at Marlow Hollow rather than the grand chapel at Ravensmere, because Eleanor had asked for it plainly and Julian had found he wanted nothing else either. Tom Hartley stood beside his sister in his uniform, and half the village came, and old Tom Fenner told anyone who would listen that he had once had a duke stack his hay and never once complain of his back, and no one quite believed him, and he did not mind. The shop at the end of Weaver's Row stayed open. Eleanor kept it herself 3 days a week, mending coats and cutting patterns exactly as she always had, and it became known in time as the only shop in England where a duchess might be found with pins between her teeth and chalk dust on her sleeve, and where a duke, on the days he could be spared from the estate, could sometimes be seen hauling bolts of cloth from the cart without complaint, and setting hems, badly at first and then, slowly, with something approaching skill. In the small back room at Ravensmere, where the cedar trunks were kept, there hung a dark green coat, torn once at the shoulder and mended by candlelight with small, sure stitches, that Julian never wore again and never, for as long as he lived, allowed anyone to give away because it was, he told his children years later, the only coat he had ever owned that had shown him exactly what he was worth, and he had learned, wearing it, that a man could be loved for himself alone, if only he was brave enough to risk the asking. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If this moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. Your support keeps these stories alive.